New York City, the early 1930s. The skyline glittered with ambition, yet beneath the towers of glass and steel, the streets pulsed with something darker. Power, money, and fear wove together in the smoke of speakeasies and the whispers of alleyways. In that shadowed world, one man moved unseen yet unstoppable, a ghost in a tailored suit, with a calm smile that could either make a man rich or bury him by sunrise. His name was Charles "Lucky" Luciano. To some, he was the architect of modern organized crime. To others, he was a phantom, the man whose enemies never saw him coming until it was far too late. He wasn't the kind of gangster the newspapers wanted to print about, not a loudmouth, not a brute who fired guns in public or flaunted his wealth like a badge. Luciano understood something deeper. Real power didn't shout. It whispered. It hid behind respectability, behind the illusion of friendship. While other mobsters built their reputations through blood and violence, Luciano built his through trust, strategy, and timing. He knew that fear alone couldn't hold an empire together, it had to be mixed with loyalty, and loyalty could only be bought through opportunity. But before he became the invisible king of the underworld, the American mafia was a mess, divided, unorganized, and trapped in old traditions that made them predictable. The old bosses clung to codes of honor that belonged to another world, another country. Luciano was different. He saw America for what it truly was, not just a place of laws and dreams, but a marketplace of power. Everything, from politicians to police to prohibition, had a price. And if he could understand the price of things, he could control them. It was this understanding that made him so dangerous. He didn't rule through terror. He ruled through structure. He could read a man's ambition like a map, find what he wanted, give him a taste of it, and make him believe it was his own idea to serve. His enemies never stood a chance because by the time they realized they were playing his game, they were already part of his system. Luciano's rise wasn't just about crime, it was about evolution. He modernized the mafia the way Henry Ford modernized the automobile, turning chaos into industry, giving purpose to violence, and applying logic to the illogical. He replaced superstition with strategy, replaced loyalty to one man with loyalty to profit. In his world, everyone could eat, as long as they ate from his table. Yet what made him a legend wasn't just what he built, but how he disappeared within it. He didn't crave the spotlight. He didn't want statues or songs. Power, for Luciano, was about invisibility. The less they saw, the more control he had. He could walk into a crowded room and leave without anyone realizing the balance of power had just shifted. To him, the perfect victory was one that didn't need to be declared. As the city roared with jazz and bootleg whiskey, Luciano quietly rewrote the language of organized crime. He was a businessman dressed as a gangster, a visionary cloaked in danger. The newspapers would later call him ruthless, cunning, cold. But those who truly knew him said something different, that he was the calm in the storm, the mind that turned the chaos of New York's underworld into a single, breathing organism. He didn't just survive the streets, he mastered them. And as his empire grew from gambling dens and speakeasies to international networks of power, he never lost sight of his ultimate rule: control the flow, and you control the men. His enemies, whether gangsters or politicians, never saw him coming because they looked for threats in the obvious places: guns, gangs, violence. Luciano wasn't there. He was the man standing beside them, smiling, shaking their hand. Every kingdom has a king, but only one man ever built an empire that thrived in darkness. Before the world called him a criminal mastermind, before his name became synonymous with the American mafia, Charles "Lucky" Luciano had already learned one of the oldest lessons of power: visibility is vulnerability. And for the man who built the invisible throne, staying unseen was the most dangerous weapon of all. The story of Lucky Luciano cannot be told without first stepping into the world that shaped him, the roaring, chaotic, and merciless streets of early 20th century New York. The year was 1906 when a 9-year-old boy named Salvatore Lucania arrived from Sicily with his family, stepping off the ship at Ellis Island into a city that promised dreams but delivered struggle. The Lower East Side was a jungle of tenements, immigrants, and hunger. Italians, Jews, Irish, Germans, all stacked in the same filthy buildings, each fighting for a piece of survival. In those narrow streets, boys learned early that fists and fear spoke louder than laws. The Lucania family came with nothing. His father worked long hours in a sulfur factory, his mother sewed clothes by candlelight. Salvatore, like most immigrant children, went to school only until he could understand enough English to be useful. But school couldn't compete with the excitement outside. On every corner stood a gang, and on every corner stood a chance to make money, to escape the stink of poverty that clung to the walls of their rooms. The young boy learned fast that respect wasn't given to the honest, it was given to the fearless. By the time he was 10, Salvatore was already running errands for older boys, carrying stolen goods, acting as a lookout for petty theft. It wasn't innocence that guided him, but curiosity. He wanted to understand how power worked. Why did some boys walk the streets without fear while others hid from them? He noticed patterns. The ones with money were the ones who gave orders, not the ones who obeyed them. And in a neighborhood ruled by survival, he realized the truth early: it was better to be feared than forgotten. New York in those years was alive with contradictions. The same city that built cathedrals and skyscrapers also built criminal empires. Prohibition hadn't yet begun, but corruption already ran deep. Cops took bribes, politicians looked the other way, and judges owed favors to gang bosses. In that environment, morality was a luxury few could afford. The young Lucania absorbed it all. He learned to speak like an American but think like a survivor. His Sicilian roots taught him loyalty, but New York taught him opportunity. In the crowded backstreets near the Bowery and Mulberry Bend, Salvatore met kids who would later become legends in their own right: Meyer Lansky, a brilliant Jewish hustler with a mathematical mind, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, volatile and fearless, and others who, like him, were building their reputations one street fight at a time. They were different in heritage but united by one philosophy: money had no language, and neither did ambition. As a teenager, Salvatore began to refine his craft. He ran gambling operations, sold protection to smaller dealers, and moved into the narcotics trade, small steps that built a reputation for reliability and cold precision. He didn't have to shout to be heard, he simply delivered results. The older gang leaders began to notice him. He could negotiate without losing his temper, and when violence was required, he chose it like a surgeon: quick, clean, and final. He was learning how to blend brutality with intelligence, a combination that would make him unstoppable later in life. Around this time, he earned the nickname Lucky. Some said it was because he survived a brutal attack that left scars across his face and a permanent lesson in trust. Others claimed it was because he always seemed to walk away from death with a smirk. But for Luciano, luck wasn't divine. It was calculated. He believed luck came to those who made their own odds, and he was already stacking the deck. The city around him was transforming. Immigrants poured in by the thousands. Prohibition loomed on the horizon, promising a golden age for those bold enough to turn liquor into gold. Gangs that once fought over corners were now preparing to fight over empires. Luciano stood at the edge of it all, young but already seasoned. He could feel that a new order was coming, one that would reward visionaries, not traditionalists. What separated him from the rest was perception. Where others saw the city as a battlefield, Luciano saw it as a network, a living organism of supply and demand, greed and need. Every cop, every politician, every business had a weakness. All he had to do was find it. He began cultivating relationships, paying off officials, learning the language of the upper world while still walking among the underworld. He was a bridge between two realities, and bridges, he understood, controlled the flow. By the early 1920s, the Sicilian gangs still operated like medieval families, bound by blood oaths and superstition. Luciano saw that as weakness. He respected tradition but refused to be its prisoner. America, he believed, wasn't Sicily, it was faster, louder, and more ruthless. To survive here, you had to evolve. The boy from the Lower East Side had already begun transforming into the man who would one day command the entire underworld of New York. The streets had taught him everything: how to lie without guilt, how to read eyes instead of words, and how to make a promise sound like a threat. Each lesson carved him into something harder, something sharper. While his friends chased quick money and glory, Luciano studied patterns, the movements of rival gangs, the habits of police patrols, the rhythm of the city itself. He wasn't chasing power yet, he was learning how to build it. By the time he reached his 20s, lucky Luciano had outgrown the streets that raised him. He had the charm to win allies, the cruelty to keep them in line, and the intelligence to see 10 moves ahead. The city had made him tough, but it had also made him patient. The kid who once fought for nickels on Mulberry Street now dreamed in millions. The world around him was shifting, and soon, the chaos of New York would meet the mind of a man who saw not disorder, but opportunity. The streets had given birth to many gangsters, but only one architect of the modern mafia. And he was just getting started. The young man who now called himself Lucky had shed the last traces of the poor Sicilian boy named Salvatore Lucania. By the time he reached his early 20s, he was no longer just another street hustler. He had become something more dangerous, a man who understood people better than they understood themselves. In the melting pot of New York's criminal underworld, he was already a quiet strategist, watching from the sidelines while others burned themselves out chasing quick fame. To Luciano, every fight, every deal, every betrayal was a lesson. He was building a system inside his mind long before the world realized it existed. His early years in organized crime were shaped by the volatile energy of the 1920s, the decade that transformed America. Prohibition had just turned alcohol into the most profitable illegal business on the continent. Overnight, liquor became liquid gold, and everyone wanted in: Irish gangs, Jewish syndicates, Italian families. New York became a city divided by booze routes and backroom alliances. To the cops, these men were criminals; to each other, they were businessmen in a lawless economy. Luciano saw this new world not as chaos, but as opportunity, a moment in history when a clever man could rewrite the rules. He began working under powerful Italian mob bosses who controlled sections of Manhattan. The Sicilian Mustache Petes, as they were called, ruled with old-world pride and stubborn tradition. They demanded loyalty based on heritage and blood, not results. Luciano, however, wasn't a believer in blind loyalty. He respected strength, but not arrogance. To him, respect had to be earned, not inherited. He quickly saw that these old bosses were clinging to outdated methods, fighting wars over territory while ignoring the bigger picture. They were trapped in the past, while Luciano's mind was already in the future. It was during this time that he began building friendships that would define his empire. He found kinship with Meyer Lansky, the quiet Jewish gambler whose mathematical brain could calculate risk like a machine. Lansky wasn't violent, but he understood control, the kind that came from organization and trust. Together, they shared an idea that bordered on treason in the mafia world: what if Italians, Jews, and Irish worked together? What if business replaced ethnicity as the bond of power? It was a revolutionary thought, and one that would change organized crime forever. Alongside Lansky came Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, wild, fearless, and magnetic. Siegel was everything Luciano wasn't: impulsive, emotional, unpredictable. But Lucky understood that every empire needed both fire and ice. Lansky was the planner, Siegel was the weapon. Luciano stood between them, the mind that balanced chaos and calculation. The trio formed a bond that transcended loyalty. They were businessmen disguised as gangsters, visionaries disguised as criminals. But before he could rise, Luciano had to survive. In the criminal underworld, intelligence invited jealousy. His ability to maneuver between ethnic lines made him dangerous to the old Sicilian bosses. He could smile in a room full of enemies and leave with all of them owing him a favor, a skill that frightened men who ruled by fear alone. One night in 1929, that fear nearly killed him. He was picked up by 4 men, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on Staten Island beach. They slit his throat, cut his face, and left him bleeding under the night sky. But somehow, he lived. When he stumbled into the hospital the next morning, no one could believe it. His face was scarred for life, his right eye drooping slightly, his jaw forever uneven, but his will was sharper than ever. The newspapers said he was lucky to be alive. The name stuck, but to Luciano, it wasn't luck. It was survival. It was proof that he was chosen for something greater. He never revealed who ordered the attack. Some said it was a rival gang. Others whispered it came from within his own ranks. But Luciano had already learned one of his most powerful lessons: never let revenge distract you from the goal. His scars became his armor. They gave him an aura of danger, a permanent reminder of what it meant to be underestimated. After the attack, Luciano began to refine his philosophy of power. Violence, he realized, should be used sparingly, like a knife that's kept sharp but hidden. To control men, you didn't need to fear them, you needed to own their interests. Every man had a price, and Luciano became an expert at finding it. He bribed police officers, charmed politicians, and built alliances with bootleggers who ran whiskey from Canada to New York. In every deal, he remained invisible, a name whispered, not shouted. By the early 1930s, Luciano had positioned himself as the bridge between old and new, between muscle and intellect. He was still technically under the command of Joe, the boss, Masuria, the reigning mafia king of New York, but Luciano was no longer content being anyone's subordinate. He saw how the city's criminal world was evolving, how Americans wanted efficiency, not ceremony. The days of bowing to mustached old men in smoky restaurants were fading. Luciano wanted to replace superstition with structure, instinct with system. He began quietly testing his ideas. He encouraged cooperation between rival gangs, sharing profits instead of blood. He diversified into gambling, narcotics, and labor racketeering, all organized through a network of trusted associates rather than blind loyalty. He built a hierarchy based on capability, not family. Slowly, the younger generation of gangsters began gravitating toward him. They saw in Luciano not just a leader, but a symbol of the modern world, ambitious, adaptable, and unshackled by old codes. Every decision he made was part of a larger plan. Luciano wasn't trying to be another boss, he was designing a system that could outlive him. In a city fueled by greed and betrayal, he was quietly writing the blueprint for the future of organized crime. The kid from the Lower East Side had become a man who understood the rhythm of power, when to wait, when to strike, and when to vanish. And as New York plunged deeper into the chaos of gang wars, Lucky Luciano was already several steps ahead. His enemies saw only another ambitious gangster, hungry for power. What they didn't see was the architect beneath the surface, the man who would soon reshape the very structure of the underworld. They would learn too late that Luciano didn't just play the game, he was rewriting its rules. Before Lucky Luciano could seize control of the underworld, that world first had to tear itself apart. The New York of the early 1930s was a battleground, a city where power had no rules and loyalty had an expiration date. The mafia, still in its infancy in America, was a loose collection of clans, each led by old-world bosses who ruled through fear and tradition. They called themselves men of honor, but behind the veil of their Sicilian codes, they were little more than feudal warlords fighting over scraps of territory. The air was thick with paranoia. Every handshake hid suspicion, and every meal could end in a bullet. To outsiders, the mafia looked powerful. In truth, it was splintered and inefficient. The old bosses, men like Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, ran their families like medieval kingdoms. They believed leadership was inherited, not earned. Their soldiers paid tribute to them in money and blood, and their authority came from fear, not respect. They trusted only their own kind, refusing to do business with non-Italians, even when it cost them profit. They called it tradition. Luciano called it stupidity. He saw that the mafia's obsession with the past was its greatest weakness. While the old dons clung to Sicilian customs, America was changing. Prohibition had turned crime into a billion-dollar industry, and the real power no longer lay in who could kill the most enemies, but in who could organize them. Luciano looked around and saw chaos, gangs fighting over bootleg routes, bribes wasted on double-dealing cops, fortunes lost to ego and revenge. It was a criminal economy without structure, bleeding money because no one had the vision to see beyond their own pride. Joe Masuria, Luciano's own boss, was the perfect example of this decay. He dressed like a king, dined in public with arrogance, and demanded that everyone kiss his hand. To him, Luciano was a useful soldier, ambitious but controllable. He had no idea that the young man sitting quietly at his table was already plotting a new world. Luciano watched Masuria's arrogance with cold fascination. The old man was powerful, yes, but he was predictable, and predictable men don't last long in a world built on betrayal. At the same time, across the city, another power was rising, Salvatore Maranzano, a rival Sicilian who saw himself as Julius Caesar reborn. Maranzano believed he was destined to rule all of New York's mafia families. He brought with him soldiers from Castellammarese del Golfo, Sicily, men loyal to him by blood. The result was inevitable, two ancient worlds colliding in a new country that neither truly understood. The newspapers would later call it the Castellammarese War, but for the men who fought it, it was simply survival, a bloody, drawn-out struggle that would claim dozens of lives and change organized crime forever. Luciano, still officially serving under Masuria, found himself in the middle of this civil war. On one side stood his own boss, loud and prideful, on the other, Maranzano, cunning and ruthless. But unlike the old men, Luciano wasn't loyal to a name, he was loyal to opportunity. He began quietly reaching out to both camps, gathering information, studying their patterns. He realized something no one else did: it wasn't the bullets that would decide this war, it was strategy. While others fought and died, Luciano built alliances. He opened channels of communication with Lansky and Siegel, who maintained neutrality and supplied both sides with weapons and intelligence. He began making secret deals with Maranzano's men, whispering promises of peace and profit once the dust settled. Every move was deliberate, every word chosen with precision. To both Masuria and Maranzano, he appeared loyal; to his peers, he appeared cautious. But in truth, he was positioning himself as the only man who could bring order once the war inevitably destroyed both kings. The city bled through the early 1930s. Restaurants became ambush sites, cars exploded on quiet streets, and old friendships ended with quiet funerals. But Luciano didn't flinch. He understood something that few men ever did, that chaos, if guided properly, could be used as a tool. While everyone else tried to win the war, Luciano was preparing to win what came after it. He began speaking in terms that sounded strange to other mobsters: structure, organization, balance. He imagined the mafia not as a collection of families but as a corporation, each family a department, each boss a shareholder. He dreamed of a council where disputes could be settled without bloodshed, where business would take priority over ego. To his peers, it sounded impossible. To Luciano, it was destiny. But to reach that future, he first had to end the old one. The only way to build order was to destroy the chaos. And for that, both Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano had to go. Luciano began setting the stage with cold precision. He continued to dine with Masuria, laughing at his jokes, promising loyalty. He accepted missions, brought profits, and even shielded his boss from assassination attempts. All the while, he was negotiating with Maranzano behind the curtain, arranging the perfect double cross. To the men who followed him, Luciano seemed fearless. In truth, he was playing a game that could only end one of two ways: with absolute power or with a bullet in the back of his head. But he didn't hesitate. He knew that history doesn't remember survivors, it remembers architects. In the final months of the Castellammarese War, the tension in New York was suffocating. Every whisper carried danger, every ally could be a traitor. Yet through it all, Luciano remained calm. He was no longer thinking like a gangster. He was thinking like a ruler. He had studied the old world's mistakes and now intended to erase them. His vision wasn't of bloodlines and rituals, it was of systems and control. The mafia didn't know it yet, but a revolution was coming. The old order of kings and soldiers was about to collapse, and from its ashes would rise something colder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous, a modern empire of crime, designed by a man who could see the future while everyone else was still fighting the past. Lucky Luciano wasn't just waiting for victory. He was already planning the world that would follow it. Luciano's rise was not just a product of circumstance, it was built on relationships, alliances, and an almost surgical understanding of human psychology. In the violent, unstable world of New York's underworld, loyalty was currency, and betrayal was the cost of failure. From the beginning, Luciano understood that survival, and eventual domination, depended as much on allies as on weapons. He chose his companions carefully, cultivating friendships that were practical, yet often personal, and he surrounded himself with men who could complement his mind with muscle, vision with execution. Meyer Lansky was his first and most important partner. Lansky was nothing like the stereotypical mobster, quiet, calculating, and methodical. He had a mathematical mind that could calculate risk with a precision most men could only dream of. Luciano recognized that Lansky's talents went far beyond counting cards or running gambling operations, he could help organize a criminal empire like a legitimate business. Together, they formed a bond that was as strategic as it was personal. Where Luciano provided vision and political maneuvering, Lansky provided the numbers, the logistics, and the patience to see long-term plans through. Then there was Benjamin "Bugsy" Siegel, the volatile force of nature who contrasted sharply with Luciano's measured demeanor. Siegel was fearless to the point of recklessness, willing to use violence where diplomacy might fail. To an outsider, the pairing seemed precarious, ice and fire, intellect and instinct, yet it worked. Luciano understood that empires required both brains and brawn, and that fear could be wielded selectively to maintain control. Bugsy became the sharp edge of Luciano's strategies, the man who could intimidate rivals while Luciano planned their eventual downfall. Beyond these prominent figures, Luciano's network was vast and intricate. He reached out to men across ethnic lines, building a coalition that would become revolutionary. Italian, Jewish, Irish, in the old world, such alliances would have been unthinkable. But Luciano didn't see ethnicity, he saw talent, opportunity, and influence. By bridging these divides, he created a web of loyalty that transcended traditional boundaries. Each man he brought into his orbit owed him something, not always money, but often a chance at survival, a taste of power, or a promise of profit. Luciano's genius lay not only in choosing allies but also in understanding enemies. He watched, listened, and learned, observing patterns in behavior that others overlooked. Where a typical gangster might react with impulsive violence, Luciano analyzed. He knew that understanding ambition, greed, and fear in others was the first step to controlling them. He could spot jealousy before it turned to betrayal and pride before it turned to war. In many ways, his allies and enemies alike were chess pieces, and he always thought several moves ahead. Within this network, loyalty was constantly tested. The mafia world was rife with betrayal, and Luciano knew that a single misstep could cost a life. He cultivated trust through rewards, opportunities, and calculated displays of generosity. Men followed him not merely because they feared punishment but because they understood the advantage of alignment. Being with Luciano meant survival, profit, and influence. Being against him meant invisibility or death. He balanced kindness with ruthlessness, friendship with manipulation, a duality that made him both respected and feared. Alliances were formalized through ceremonies, secret meetings, and whispered oaths, but Luciano's true mastery was in his subtle psychological manipulation. He understood that human behavior could be molded through perception. A compliment here, a threat there, a discreet promise of future opportunity, these were the tools of a modern Don. By appealing simultaneously to loyalty, ambition, and fear, he created a network that seemed organic, even voluntary, but was under his invisible control. This web of allies allowed him to operate in ways others could not. While rival bosses expended their energy on petty wars and revenge killings, Luciano's network moved like a silent machine. Information flowed through trusted channels. Operations ran smoothly. Opportunities were seized with precision. He had essentially outsourced chaos to others while keeping the strategic vision in his own hands. And because he trusted his men to act within the framework he had established, he could focus on expansion, negotiation, and the careful elimination of threats. Even betrayal became a tool under Luciano's control. He allowed minor acts of defiance to surface, observing how men reacted under pressure. Some were punished quietly, others co-opted, and still others discarded when no longer useful. By using loyalty and treachery in tandem, he reinforced the idea that allegiance was both valuable and dangerous. His men never fully knew when they were being tested, which created a psychological advantage. Uncertainty became a means of control. Through these relationships, Luciano learned one of the most critical lessons of leadership in the criminal world: power is not about fear alone, nor is it about brute force. True power lies in perception, in the belief that one man can see, plan, and act in ways others cannot. Allies and enemies alike became instruments in his larger vision, and the boundaries between friendship and manipulation blurred. Loyalty was a currency he traded in carefully, rewarding those who served his vision and removing those who threatened it. By the mid-1930s, this carefully constructed network had positioned Luciano at the epicenter of New York's criminal universe. He could call on his allies to execute operations, settle disputes, or eliminate threats, often without appearing in public. His influence extended beyond the streets to politics, law enforcement, and legitimate business. Yet for all his reach, Luciano remained invisible to many, a shadow whose presence was felt but rarely seen. It was this combination of strategic alliances, psychological insight, and calculated risk that allowed lucky Luciano to outmaneuver his rivals during the turbulent years of the Castellammarese War. While others relied on violence alone, he relied on networks, on relationships that functioned like a living organism, each part sustaining the whole. Through blood and strategy, trust and intimidation, Luciano had built a machine that could survive chaos and manipulate it simultaneously. By the time the war ended, Luciano was no longer simply a rising gangster. He was a master of human behavior, a tactician who had turned alliances into weapons and loyalty into leverage. His empire was not yet fully realized, but its foundation was solid, unshakable, and invisible to the very enemies who believed themselves secure in their old ways. In the world of organized crime, lucky Luciano was becoming more than a man, he was becoming the architect of power itself. The Castellammarese War was not just a battle for territory, it was a crucible that tested the very essence of power in New York's underworld. On one side stood Joe Masuria, the established Sicilian don whose authority rested on tradition, fear, and the loyalty of men bound by blood and heritage. On the other stood Salvatore Maranzano, the ambitious newcomer who believed that destiny had crowned him the true ruler of the city's criminal empire. The streets became a chessboard, with lives as pawns, and the city itself as the prize. Each assassination, each ambush, each betrayal was a calculated move, and in the middle of this chaos, lucky Luciano quietly observed, learned, and maneuvered with a patience that bordered on genius. Luciano had already decided that allegiance to either Masuria or Maranzano would be temporary. He was not bound by tradition or loyalty, he was bound by opportunity. While Masuria fought openly, confident in his brute force, and Maranzano maneuvered subtly, relying on fear and reputation, Luciano operated in the spaces in between, the shadows, the whispered conversations, the backroom deals. He was patient, understanding that history would reward the man who could survive long enough to strike at the right moment. The young Don's strategy was audacious. He cultivated trust with both sides, offering his services as a soldier to Masuria while secretly negotiating with Maranzano. Every mission he carried out, every order he obeyed, served a dual purpose: to gain credibility with his current boss and to position himself favorably with the rival faction. Luciano became a bridge, a man with one foot in each camp, a living conduit of information and influence. To his enemies, he appeared loyal, to his allies, indispensable. Yet no one suspected that he was already planning to reshape the entire hierarchy once the war ended. Violence around him was relentless. Speakeasies turned into killing grounds. Restaurants were bombed. Drive-by shootings became a terrifyingly common way to settle disputes. Yet Luciano remained calm, almost detached, as if he were observing an experiment unfold. Every death, every betrayal, every errant shot was data, a lesson in human behavior, power dynamics, and opportunity. He could calculate the effect of each strike on the balance of power, anticipating responses before they happened. While other men acted out of emotion or pride, Luciano acted from strategy. The assassination of Joe Masuria was the first turning point, a masterstroke of planning and timing. Luciano orchestrated the killing with such precision that it seemed almost accidental, a casual meeting, a friendly dinner, momentary lapse in vigilance, and Masuria was gone. The act was not just elimination, it was a statement. The old guard could be removed quietly, efficiently, and without destabilizing the structure he intended to inherit. It was a moment that proved Luciano's philosophy: intelligence and timing outweighed brute force. With Masuria gone, Maranzano briefly claimed dominance, setting himself up as the new king of New York's mafia. But Luciano had learned that the old-world ways of hierarchy and fear were unstable. Maranzano demanded loyalty, insisted on titles, and ruled with intimidation, all traits that would soon become his downfall. Luciano watched, waiting for the precise moment to act. He had spent years studying ambition, pride, and the weaknesses of men in power. Maranzano's arrogance made him predictable, and predictability, Luciano knew, was a weakness no enemy could survive. The assassination of Maranzano was even more audacious than the first. While Maranzano surrounded himself with bodyguards and enforced old-world respect, Luciano infiltrated his inner circle through alliances, bribes, and careful manipulation. He waited until the moment was right, then struck decisively, ensuring that no rival boss remained who could challenge his vision. Within months, the war that had seemed endless came to a sudden, almost poetic conclusion, with Luciano standing as the undisputed architect of New York's criminal universe. But victory was not simply about eliminating rivals. It was about consolidating power in a way that ensured long-term stability. Luciano understood that killing the kings was only the first step. To prevent future wars, he needed a system that balanced authority, profit, and loyalty. The old mafia had been feudal and chaotic. Luciano envisioned a modern empire, where disputes were settled by negotiation rather than bullets, and profit, rather than pride, determined leadership. The Castellammarese war had taught him the cost of disorder, and he was determined never to pay it again. Allies like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel played crucial roles during this period, ensuring that Luciano could manage operations across multiple territories. Lansky's ability to organize gambling operations and track financial flows allowed Luciano to maintain revenue even as the city burned around them. Siegel's reputation for violence deterred those who might have challenged their authority prematurely. Together, they formed a triumvirate that balanced intellect, brutality, and foresight, a combination the old guard had never anticipated. The psychological impact of the war on Luciano himself cannot be overstated. He had witnessed firsthand the fragility of human ambition, the volatility of loyalty, and the catastrophic consequences of miscalculation. These lessons were seared into his strategy, informing every decision he would make for decades. He learned that power was most secure when invisible, when influence was wielded subtly rather than ostentatiously. By the time he claimed dominance, he had internalized the ultimate truth: the greatest strength in the criminal world was not firepower, but foresight. When the dust settled, lucky Luciano had achieved more than victory, he had achieved transformation. He had turned a chaotic, violent underworld into a structure capable of sustaining itself. No longer would the mafia be defined by personal grudges or old-world traditions. Under Luciano, it would be defined by organization, efficiency, and profitability. The war had tested him, refined him, and elevated him from a street-smart hustler to the visionary leader who would permanently reshape organized crime in America. The Castellammarese War was the proving ground, the crucible in which Luciano's genius was revealed. It was a brutal, bloody affair, but for him, it was also a classroom. Each kill, each betrayal, each alliance offered insight. By the end of it, he had not only survived, he had mastered the battlefield, understood the psychology of his peers, and set the stage for the empire that would cement his place in history. The streets of New York had produced many gangsters, but only lucky Luciano emerged from the war as a true architect of power, a man whose enemies never even realized the game had changed until it was far too late. With the dust of the Castellammarese War settling, lucky Luciano faced a new challenge, transforming victory into lasting power. The streets of New York had been cleared of the old guard, the chaotic reigns of Masuria and Maranzano ended with brutal efficiency. But removing rivals was only the first step. Luciano knew all too well that without structure, without a system to manage ambition, the city could plunge back into violence as soon as he turned his back. The old mafia had thrived on fear, titles, and bloodlines. Luciano intended to replace that with a vision that was cleaner, smarter, and far more durable. He would become the architect of a criminal empire unlike anything America had ever seen. At the heart of Luciano's strategy was the Commission, a governing council designed to prevent future wars and balance the interests of different families. The idea was revolutionary. Rather than one man holding absolute power, the mafia would operate like a corporate board, each family represented, each vote weighed. Disputes would be settled through negotiation and compromise rather than gunfire. It was a system designed for longevity, a network that ensured no single boss could dominate unchallenged. In creating the Commission, Luciano demonstrated not just tactical genius but a visionary understanding of human behavior. Power is strongest when it is shared strategically, when it is invisible yet enforceable. The creation of the Commission required careful diplomacy. Luciano reached out to former rivals, men who had been enemies only months before. Some were skeptical, others outright hostile. Yet Luciano's reputation for foresight and fairness, combined with the quiet power he had amassed during the war, allowed him to persuade key figures to join the new order. Men who had once aimed pistols at his back now sat across from him at tables, negotiating profit-sharing agreements, boundaries, and codes of conduct. To them, it was a tentative alliance. To Luciano, it was the foundation of an empire. Luciano's genius was not limited to organizational structure. He revolutionized the business of crime itself, transforming chaotic bootlegging, gambling, and narcotics into enterprises that could be managed with efficiency akin to legitimate corporations. He implemented standardized practices, delegated authority, and demanded accountability. Men were rewarded for results, not simply for loyalty. Profit became the currency of power, a principle that would sustain his empire for decades. Under Luciano, the mafia ceased to be a loose collection of territorial gangs and became a network of interlocking businesses, each feeding the other and collectively producing immense wealth. But the brilliance of Luciano's empire lay in its psychological architecture as much as its financial one. He understood that people crave order, even criminals. By creating systems, rules, and clear lines of authority, he instilled a sense of predictability and security in his associates. Soldiers who once feared arbitrary violence now operated within a framework that rewarded performance and punished betrayal. Ambition was channeled rather than suppressed, loyalty cultivated rather than demanded, and fear used sparingly as a tool rather than a weapon of constant oppression. In effect, Luciano had professionalized crime, and the result was a level of efficiency and stability previously unseen in New York. Allies like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel became essential executors of this vision. Lansky's analytical mind and business acumen allowed the financial aspects of the empire to flourish, while Siegel's willingness to enforce decisions through violence provided a deterrent to dissenters. Luciano balanced these forces expertly, blending intimidation with strategy, fire with ice. Men trusted him not just because he could protect them but because he could expand their opportunities. Aligning with Luciano meant access to a network that extended across the city, across industries, and eventually across continents. Perhaps most importantly, Luciano's empire was built on flexibility. He refused to be rigid in ideology or method. Where the old bosses had clung to ethnic exclusivity, superstition, and tradition, Luciano embraced pragmatism. Italian, Jewish, Irish, any competent and trustworthy operator could find a place in his system. This openness not only increased his pool of talent but also ensured that he remained several steps ahead of rivals who clung stubbornly to outdated methods. By creating a meritocratic underworld, Luciano ensured that loyalty would be based on mutual benefit rather than fear or blood alone. The new structure also allowed for unprecedented control over vice industries. Luciano's reach extended into gambling dens, prostitution rings, bootlegging networks, and labor rackets. By consolidating control and regulating competition, he reduced waste, minimized exposure to law enforcement, and maximized profits. Corruption became another layer of the system. Police, judges, and politicians were either bribed or intimidated into compliance, further insulating Luciano's operations. Every piece of the empire worked in concert, as if orchestrated by a single mind, a mind that was, in fact, Luciano's. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Luciano's empire was his ability to remain unseen. He did not need to flaunt power through public displays of violence or ostentatious wealth. Instead, influence radiated outward from him invisibly. Orders flowed through trusted lieutenants, profits were funneled through intermediaries, and threats were executed quietly. To the public, crime seemed chaotic; to the mafia, it appeared organized. In reality, both were manifestations of Luciano's design. By staying in the shadows, he retained the ultimate advantage. No one could anticipate his next move because no one fully understood his system. The empire Luciano built after the war was more than just a criminal network, it was a blueprint for modern organized crime. He demonstrated that intelligence, strategy, and psychological insight could outperform brute force. Where old bosses relied on intimidation and ritual, Luciano relied on networks and incentives. Where others saw only chaos, he saw patterns to be leveraged. The streets of New York, once a jungle of violence and fear, had been transformed into a controlled, profitable organism, capable of sustaining power across generations. Through the commission, through careful alliances, through the professionalization of crime, and through his mastery of human behavior, Luciano solidified his place as the true architect of power. Men who had once scoffed at his youth and inexperience now deferred to him. Rival families recognized that the old methods were obsolete. The underworld had been reordered, and at the center of this new order sat lucky Luciano, calm, calculating, and almost invisible, a man whose enemies never saw him coming and whose empire would endure long after his rivals were gone. Luciano had not just survived the chaos of New York, he had rewritten its rules. By balancing violence with diplomacy, ambition with structure, and fear with opportunity, he had created a criminal ecosystem that was both resilient and efficient. The era of unpredictable bloodshed had ended. In its place rose the modern mafia, disciplined, interconnected, and guided by a man whose vision extended far beyond the streets he once roamed. This was the dawn of a new order, and lucky Luciano was its undisputed architect. The years following the Castellammarese War were deceptively quiet on the surface, but beneath the calm, a hidden war was raging, a war of influence, control, and survival. Lucky Luciano had secured his dominance over New York's criminal underworld, but power, as he well knew, was never permanent. The city's streets were littered with men who had once been kings and had been violently removed. The lessons of Masuria and Maranzano were fresh in every gangster's mind. Every ally had an ambition, every subordinate harbored a potential grudge, and every former enemy watched for a weakness to exploit. The hidden war was psychological, systemic, and relentless, and it demanded as much attention as the bullets and blood of the past. Luciano's genius lay in recognizing that control was not maintained by sheer violence alone. Traditional mobsters had relied on displays of brutality to command obedience, but such methods were inherently unstable. Fear can enforce loyalty temporarily, but it cannot sustain it indefinitely. Luciano understood that men, even criminals, operate on incentives, opportunities, and perceived self-interest. To dominate New York's underworld, he would have to manage ambitions, neutralize threats subtly, and ensure that loyalty was voluntary, earned through profit and promise rather than enforced through fear. The first battlefield was perception. While his rivals assumed that their power was solid, Luciano quietly orchestrated a network of surveillance and intelligence. Trusted lieutenants monitored the activities of every significant figure, gathering information on movements, alliances, and vulnerabilities. Every gambling den, speakeasy, and nightclub served as both revenue source and observation post. Men who thought they were acting independently were, in reality, being guided into patterns that strengthened Luciano's position. He had created a system in which he rarely needed to appear in person, influence radiated invisibly, like a shadow stretching across the city. At the same time, law enforcement and politicians loomed as constant threats. Prohibition had officially ended, but the networks that had grown around bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering did not disappear. Police departments were riddled with corruption, yet there were always honest officers and ambitious investigators who sought to challenge the criminal order. Luciano used these pressures strategically. He cultivated politicians, bribed law enforcement officials, and manipulated public perception to ensure that his operations were insulated from interference. Every investigation, every raid, every arrest attempt was anticipated and, when possible, neutralized before it could become a real threat. The hidden war also extended to the mafia itself. With Masuria and Maranzano gone, family allegiances were fragile. Younger mobsters sought to assert themselves, older men tested the limits of the new order, and outsiders viewed the vacuum as an opportunity. Luciano managed these tensions with careful diplomacy and subtle intimidation. He would meet a rival not to threaten him with a gun, but to remind him of the advantages of cooperation, the risks of defiance, and the power of his own network. Negotiation and subtle coercion became tools as lethal as bullets, and men quickly learned that Luciano's threats were always credible, even when delivered with a calm smile. Luciano's system extended beyond New York. His influence touched cities across the United States, as well as territories in the Caribbean and Europe. By coordinating operations in gambling, narcotics, and labor racketeering across regions, he created interlocking networks that made it difficult for anyone to challenge his supremacy. Control was no longer localized, it was systemic. Even when rivals attempted to expand into territories he controlled, they found themselves constrained by alliances, debts, and legal threats orchestrated from the shadows. Every move, every decision, every expansion was carefully calculated to consolidate power without provoking unnecessary conflict. One of the most effective weapons in this hidden war was information. Luciano understood that knowledge is power, and that the perception of knowledge is just as important. He used spies, informants, and trusted confidants to gather intelligence on both allies and rivals. Rumors could be manipulated to create uncertainty, and missteps could be exploited to enforce obedience. Men who believed they were acting independently were often responding to plans they did not fully comprehend, giving Luciano an invisible advantage. He controlled not only action, but expectation. The psychological component of this war was equally critical. Luciano's leadership style relied on uncertainty, calculated ambiguity, and selective generosity. He rewarded loyalty handsomely, offered protection when it served his goals, and punished disloyalty swiftly but discreetly. By maintaining an aura of unpredictability, he kept both allies and enemies off balance. No one could fully anticipate his moves, and that uncertainty reinforced his dominance. In a world where impulsive violence could destabilize empires, Luciano's methodical approach ensured stability and continuity. Even internally, tensions were constant. Lieutenants and associates sometimes coveted more than Luciano was willing to grant, and personal grievances could fester into serious threats. Luciano managed these risks with a combination of incentive, fear, and diplomacy. Promises of future opportunity, shared profits, and a clear chain of authority created alignment, while carefully timed consequences reminded everyone of the costs of defiance. Through this delicate balance, he maintained cohesion in a network composed of inherently ambitious and often violent individuals. While the public saw only the headlines of arrests, minor gangland killings, or sensational trials, the real battle was invisible. Luciano was fighting a war in the minds of men, in the perception of risk and reward, in the subtle alignment of ambition with opportunity. By the end of the 1930s, New York's underworld operated with an efficiency and stability unseen before, not because violence had ceased, but because it had been integrated into a system, controlled, and leveraged strategically. Through this hidden war, Luciano demonstrated that true power is psychological as much as physical. It is about perception, anticipation, and manipulation as much as muscle. While rivals focused on threats they could see, Luciano was orchestrating threats and opportunities they could not perceive. His empire was both invisible and omnipresent, a network that controlled outcomes without always being visible. By mastering this hidden war, Lucky Luciano secured his supremacy and reshaped the mafia into a modern organization capable of surviving beyond individual ambition. He turned violence, loyalty, and fear into tools, crafting an empire where structure and foresight replaced chaos and unpredictability. Those who underestimated him, those who believed that guns and numbers alone determined power, would learn too late that Luciano's true genius lay in the unseen, in the strategy, and in the mind that could always stay one step ahead. The veneer of invincibility that Lucky Luciano had cultivated over years of strategy and subtle manipulation began to crack in the late 1930s. For all his genius in orchestrating power behind the scenes, the machinery of organized crime was never immune to the reach of law enforcement or the consequences of human error. While he had mastered the art of controlling men, money, and perception, Luciano could not fully escape the growing attention of federal authorities, local police, and ambitious prosecutors eager to make a name for themselves. His enemies, both old and new, were also watching, waiting for an opening. The fall of a king often begins not with betrayal, but with oversight. Luciano's arrest in 1936 marked the beginning of this unraveling. Accused of compulsory prostitution and running a massive racketeering network, the charges were serious enough to bring national attention. Yet in many ways, the legal pressure was only part of the problem. The mafia, by its nature, breeds internal tension. Allies who once relied on him for guidance began to consider contingency plans. Rivals who had survived the Castellammarese war watched for signs of weakness, recognizing that even a few months of instability could allow them to seize territory or disrupt operations. In Luciano's empire, vulnerability, once exposed, was contagious. The investigation and subsequent arrest were the result of years of accumulating risk. Every empire, no matter how well structured, leaves traces, ledgers, witnesses, street-level interactions, and the occasional careless subordinate. The federal government had begun to take a systematic interest in organized crime, spurred by public outrage over prostitution, gambling, and corruption. Prosecutors realized that a figure like Luciano, who had modernized the mafia and centralized control, was both a symbolic and practical target. Bringing him down would not just punish an individual, it would disrupt an entire system. Luciano's fall began subtly, through surveillance, wiretaps, and informants. Men who had once been loyal began to crack under pressure, either turning themselves into witnesses or becoming unreliable in carrying out his directives. Operations that had run like clockwork now encountered delays, mistakes, and suspicion. Each small disruption weakened the perception of omnipotence that had made him so formidable. For a man whose power relied on perception as much as execution, these cracks were dangerous. Compounding the legal threat was betrayal from within. Even as Luciano maintained an aura of control, some lieutenants weighed their options, calculating whether loyalty to a man facing prosecution was in their best interest. Offers from prosecutors, threats from rivals, and personal ambition created a maelstrom of uncertainty. To survive, Luciano had to anticipate disloyalty even as he navigated an increasingly hostile judicial system. Every meeting, every conversation, every transaction had to be measured for risk. One wrong word could cascade into disaster. The trial itself became a spectacle. Newspapers and radio broadcasts sensationalized the charges, framing Luciano as both a master manipulator and a public menace. The courtroom was a stage on which the empire he had built was scrutinized not only by the law but by the public imagination. Witnesses testified against him, some motivated by immunity deals, others by fear or ambition. The legal arguments were complex, the strategies painstakingly prepared, but no amount of planning could fully mitigate the psychological impact. For a man accustomed to controlling narratives from the shadows, the exposure was jarring. Luciano's response was strategic. Even as the trial unfolded, he continued to exercise influence through trusted intermediaries. Orders were issued discreetly, profits were managed, and operations maintained continuity despite his physical absence. He had learned, during his rise, that power is rarely about presence, it is about control. Yet the constraints of prison and legal scrutiny introduced variables that even his foresight could not fully neutralize. The hidden war of influence now collided with an overt war of legality, and the stakes were higher than ever. During this period, the psychological toll was immense. Luciano, who had spent years projecting calm and certainty, faced the unsettling realization that he was not invulnerable. Friends could betray, rivals could strike, and the law could succeed where his careful networks had failed. The lesson of the Castellammarese War, that chaos could be managed with intelligence, now met a new reality. Institutional authority could operate at a scale and consistency that individual cunning could not always counteract. Despite these pressures, Luciano remained calculating. He navigated the courtroom drama with a mixture of charm, intimidation, and legal acumen. He leveraged relationships with politicians, judges, and corrupt officials wherever possible, mitigating some threats while intensifying others through intimidation or influence. Every move was deliberate, aimed at preserving his freedom and minimizing disruption to the empire he had built. Yet even the most careful maneuvers could not erase the fact that the law had him squarely in its sights. The arrest and trial also marked a turning point in public perception. No longer was Luciano merely a mysterious figure lurking in the shadows, he was a symbol of organized crime itself. The media attention, combined with the testimony of insiders, painted him as a man both brilliant and ruthless. This duality fascinated the public while galvanizing law enforcement. The myth and the man became inseparable, and in many ways, this narrative contributed to the pressure that would ultimately ensure his downfall. In the months that followed, the machinery of justice, combined with subtle internal pressures, gradually eroded Luciano's autonomy. He was convicted and sentenced, and the empire that had seemed unshakable now faced the challenges of operating without its mastermind fully at the helm. The fall of Luciano, however, was not a sudden collapse, it was a carefully orchestrated process, shaped by law, betrayal, and circumstance. The empire he had built would continue, but the man who had engineered it now confronted the limits of his own invincibility. The beginning of Luciano's downfall is a study in contrast, a man who had mastered chaos, predicted human behavior, and built a near-perfect system of control now faced forces beyond his command. It was a reminder that even the most intelligent and ruthless operators are vulnerable to law, time, and the subtle betrayals of men whose ambitions are as complex as their own. The arrest was the first step in a process that would test his genius, challenge his empire, and ultimately redefine his legacy. The fall had begun, and it would be as instructive as it was dramatic. The courtroom where Lucky Luciano faced trial was more than a legal arena, it was a stage on which the entire saga of his rise, power, and influence would be scrutinized under the unforgiving gaze of the public. The year was 1936, and the nation was captivated by the unfolding drama. Newspapers splashed his name across the front pages, radio broadcasts analyzed every testimony, and ordinary citizens followed the story with a mixture of fear, fascination, and moral outrage. Luciano, the man who had orchestrated an empire from the shadows, was now forced to confront the very system he had long evaded, a system capable of stripping him of freedom, reputation, and control. The charges were serious: running a vast prostitution and racketeering operation, exploiting women, and maintaining a network of criminal enterprises that spanned New York and beyond. But beyond the specifics of the law, the trial was an existential test for Luciano. It was a battlefield where his intellect, his strategy, and his psychological mastery would be pitted against a court, a jury, and a media apparatus eager to portray him as the embodiment of organized crime. Every witness, every document, every statement became a weapon in a war where survival depended on perception as much as on legal defense. Witnesses came forward with varying motivations, some seeking immunity, others coerced by law enforcement, and a few driven by vengeance or ambition. They painted Luciano as ruthless and cunning, a man capable of controlling an empire through manipulation, fear, and alliances. The public was captivated by the stories of lavish parties, secret meetings, and brutal enforcement methods. To many, Luciano was a larger-than-life figure, brilliant, terrifying, and morally compromised. Yet in the midst of this spectacle, he remained composed, projecting the calm confidence that had defined his rise. The courtroom became a theater of strategy. Luciano's lawyers worked tirelessly to counter testimony, challenge evidence, and frame the narrative in ways favorable to their client. Every argument was meticulously crafted, every cross-examination a chess move designed to expose weakness in the prosecution's case. Luciano himself was present, observing the proceedings with a calm detachment, aware that his public demeanor could influence both jury perception and media coverage. Even in captivity, he exercised subtle control, using glances, expressions, and composure to shape how he was perceived. Yet despite these efforts, the weight of evidence and the relentless prosecution made his position precarious. Investigators had meticulously documented his operations, and the testimonies of insiders painted a detailed portrait of a man who had built a criminal empire from the ground up. The scale of his influence, once an asset in the shadows, now worked against him. Every alliance, every profitable venture, every strategic maneuver became a piece of evidence, illustrating both his intelligence and his culpability. The trial also highlighted the contrast between Luciano the man and the myth. Public fascination often focused on his charisma, charm, and apparent genius, yet the courtroom revealed the cost of his ambition. The legal scrutiny, moral condemnation, and potential loss of freedom exposed vulnerabilities that no amount of strategic brilliance could completely shield. Observers witnessed the tension between a calculated operator who had manipulated men, money, and perception for decades, and the reality of a system designed to hold him accountable. The media frenzy surrounding the trial amplified its stakes. Newspapers, magazines, and radio broadcasts sensationalized every development, creating a narrative of crime, power, and betrayal that captivated the nation. The public's perception of Luciano oscillated between admiration for his cunning and revulsion at his exploitation. This duality, the interplay of myth and reality, became a critical factor in the trial, shaping jury attitudes, influencing witnesses, and reinforcing the cultural fascination with organized crime. Inside the courtroom, legal arguments were intense. Prosecutors detailed the mechanisms of his operations, describing how he controlled brothels, gambling rings, and labor rackets. They presented financial records, intercepted communications, and testimony from former associates. The defense countered with challenges to credibility, highlighting inconsistencies in witness statements and attempting to frame Luciano as a man caught in a larger, systemic problem rather than the mastermind of criminal enterprise. Every motion, objection, and statement carried weight, with each side striving to tilt perception in its favor. Ultimately, the trial was a crucible, testing not just Luciano's legal defense but the endurance of his empire. He had built a system designed to function in his absence, yet the intense scrutiny threatened its cohesion. Associates grew cautious, allies hesitated, and the once unquestioned network faced operational friction. The courtroom thus became both a personal and strategic battlefield, where survival depended on intellectual agility as much as legal skill. The sentence, when it came, was a pivotal moment in Luciano's life. Convicted and imprisoned, he faced a future that seemed at odds with the empire he had constructed. The courtroom drama had ended, but the consequences were only beginning. The trial represented a turning point, a public acknowledgement of his power, a legal reckoning for his actions, and the start of a period in which his genius would be tested against the limits of incarceration, exile, and the shifting tides of the criminal world. Even as he was led from the courtroom, Luciano's influence did not vanish. He had built networks that could operate independently, relationships that could endure scrutiny, and a reputation that still commanded respect and fear. Yet the trial underscored the fragility of even the most calculated power. It revealed the dangers of visibility, the vulnerability inherent in human networks, and the reality that no empire, no matter how well constructed, is immune to law and circumstance. The trial of Lucky Luciano was more than a legal proceeding, it was a narrative of ambition, cunning, and moral ambiguity laid bare. It forced him to confront the tangible consequences of his rise, tested the resilience of his empire, and exposed the tension between brilliance and vulnerability. While the courtroom could not destroy his vision entirely, it marked the undeniable beginning of his fall, a fall that would challenge everything he had built, from alliances to operations, and force him to navigate the precarious intersection of power, legality, and survival. Even behind the cold, iron bars of prison walls, Lucky Luciano's influence remained remarkably resilient. His arrest and conviction had removed him from the streets, but the empire he had meticulously constructed did not collapse in his absence. Unlike other gangsters who relied solely on personal presence, Luciano had designed his organization to function independently, with trusted lieutenants managing day-to-day operations. This structure allowed him to continue exercising power, directing operations, and influencing decisions from within a cell, demonstrating that true control does not require physical proximity, only strategy, foresight, and the ability to leverage human behavior. Prison, in many ways, became an extension of his network. Trusted emissaries acted as intermediaries, carrying orders, negotiating disputes, and ensuring continuity across his criminal operations. Luciano had long understood the importance of communication channels, and his ability to maintain them even while incarcerated became a testament to his genius. The streets may have been physically distant, but information flowed freely, alliances were maintained, and operations continued with remarkable efficiency. His lieutenants had internalized his methods, thinking in patterns he had established, executing strategies that mirrored his vision. Inside prison, Luciano also displayed a unique psychological mastery. Unlike many incarcerated mobsters, who succumbed to frustration, rage, or despair, he remained calm, measured, and observant. He studied his fellow inmates, evaluated staff, and anticipated the movements of law enforcement and politicians. By projecting composure and authority, he cultivated respect and, in some cases, fear. Even in confinement, Luciano commanded attention, influencing behavior without ever resorting to physical intimidation. In essence, he had turned incarceration into another environment in which his power could operate, a controlled arena rather than a constraint. One of the most significant aspects of this period was his continued oversight of criminal enterprises. Gambling dens, prostitution rings, labor rackets, and smuggling operations all required supervision, and Luciano ensured that trusted lieutenants were accountable. Men like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel acted as extensions of his will, making decisions aligned with his vision and reporting developments back to him. By cultivating loyalty, establishing clear expectations, and ensuring consequences for deviation, Luciano maintained control over a vast network, proving that leadership is not defined by presence but by influence and alignment. Luciano also understood the importance of perception. To the outside world, imprisonment might have suggested weakness, a crack in the armor of the most powerful man in organized crime. Internally, however, he made it clear that he remained the ultimate authority. Through careful messaging, intermediaries, and subtle demonstrations of power, he reinforced the notion that his incarceration did not diminish his strategic capabilities. Allies and rivals alike recognized that he was still the man who orchestrated the city's criminal universe, capable of directing outcomes without appearing publicly. The period in prison also allowed Luciano to reflect, plan, and expand his understanding of the wider forces shaping his empire. He had long navigated rivalries, betrayals, and law enforcement scrutiny, but confinement offered an opportunity to step back from the immediate chaos and analyze patterns on a larger scale. He studied how law enforcement operated, how political pressures influenced criminal activity, and how economic opportunities could be leveraged. These insights would prove invaluable not only for maintaining power from behind bars but also for shaping his strategies in the years to come. Luciano's ability to control his network from prison also demonstrated his mastery of human psychology. He knew which men would remain loyal, who could be trusted with sensitive tasks, and who might be swayed by fear or temptation. By carefully calibrating rewards, threats, and incentives, he ensured that his associates internalized his rules and priorities. The result was an organization that functioned smoothly even without his physical presence, a testament to the durability of systems built on trust, structure, and foresight rather than brute force alone. Another key element of his continued influence was the use of intermediaries to manage external pressures. Government scrutiny, media attention, and rival factions all sought to exploit his incarceration. Luciano mitigated these risks by carefully controlling the flow of information and delegating sensitive negotiations to trusted lieutenants. By maintaining indirect oversight, he ensured that threats were addressed before they could destabilize operations, demonstrating that strategic thinking could transcend the literal confines of a prison cell. Even the seemingly mundane aspects of prison life were leveraged to his advantage. Every visitor, every conversation, every interaction with guards or officials became an opportunity to gather intelligence, reinforce loyalty, or manipulate outcomes. Luciano approached each situation analytically, turning potential limitations into advantages. In this way, his incarceration became less a punishment and more a proving ground, a space in which his intellect, patience, and psychological acuity could be exercised in new ways. Power behind bars also had symbolic significance. For the broader criminal community, Luciano's continued influence reinforced his image as untouchable, brilliant, and omnipresent. Men who might have questioned his authority before now recognized that imprisonment did not diminish him. By maintaining control, he demonstrated that true leadership lies in systems, influence, and foresight, rather than in personal physical dominance. His legend, already formidable, grew stronger precisely because he proved that even confinement could not neutralize him. In many respects, Luciano's time in prison set a precedent for modern organized crime leadership. He showed that an empire could operate on principles of delegation, structure, and psychological leverage, even when its architect was physically removed. The combination of trust, loyalty, and strategic oversight ensured that operations remained profitable and disciplined. The Mafia, under his continued guidance, became a more resilient and sophisticated institution than ever before. Ultimately, Luciano's control behind bars was both practical and psychological. He maintained operational oversight, managed human behavior, and influenced events far beyond the walls of his cell. He turned incarceration into a tool rather than a limitation, proving that true power is about influence, strategy, and the ability to shape outcomes without direct presence. The empire he had built not only survived his imprisonment but also solidified under his invisible hand, demonstrating the enduring genius of a man whose enemies never saw him coming. After years behind bars, lucky Luciano faced yet another transformation, exile. Deported to Italy in 1946, he arrived in a country that was both foreign and familiar. While it was his ancestral homeland, it had changed dramatically since his youth, and he was now an outsider in a land he had only known through heritage and memory. The deportation was intended to remove him permanently from the American criminal landscape, to sever his influence over the empire he had built. Yet Luciano, ever adaptable, saw opportunity where others saw punishment. Italy became not the end, but a new chapter in the life of a man whose vision and ambition transcended borders. Exile forced Luciano to operate under new constraints, but it also allowed him to reinvent the methods of influence he had perfected in New York. He could no longer walk the streets of Manhattan, visit his speakeasies, or meet associates face to face. Communication became indirect, relying on letters, intermediaries, and trusted emissaries who could bridge the Atlantic. Yet distance did not diminish his authority. Luciano's network in the United States had matured into a system capable of functioning without constant oversight, and his reach extended even from thousands of miles away. He became a master of remote control, demonstrating once again that physical presence was never a prerequisite for power. In Italy, Luciano observed a society still recovering from war, political upheaval, and social instability. He noted how post-war reconstruction, corruption, and economic disparity created fertile ground for influence and enterprise. Here, as in America, he recognized the interplay of power, opportunity, and human behavior. Luciano studied local networks, both legitimate and illicit, identifying potential allies, testing loyalties, and cultivating connections that could expand his reach. Even in exile, he remained a strategist, calculating risks and benefits, planning for long-term advantage rather than immediate gratification. The psychological dimensions of exile were profound. Luciano faced isolation, the loss of immediate control, and the realization that his empire's center of gravity was now continents away. Yet he approached these challenges with the same calm intellect that had guided his rise. He leveraged his reputation to maintain respect and fear, sending the message that while his physical location had changed, his influence had not diminished. Allies in America continued to act in accordance with his directives, and even rivals recognized that Luciano remained a formidable figure whose judgment and authority could not be ignored. Exile also offered an opportunity for reflection and philosophical transformation. Removed from the immediate pressures of street-level criminality, Luciano could contemplate the structure, morality, and psychology of the world he had helped create. He had spent decades navigating the dangerous intersection of loyalty, ambition, and survival, and exile provided space to analyze these experiences in perspective. The man who had once thrived on control and calculation now confronted questions of legacy, mortality, and meaning, pondering what his empire had achieved and what it represented beyond profit and power. Despite the challenges, Luciano's instincts for opportunity remained sharp. He recognized the potential for transatlantic operations, influencing organized crime in Europe, North Africa, and beyond. By coordinating with trusted lieutenants and intermediaries, he extended his empire's reach, ensuring that the structures he had built in the United States remained robust. Exile, rather than ending his influence, revealed the resilience of the systems he had designed and the depth of his strategic foresight. During this period, Luciano's relationships became more deliberate and symbolic. He cultivated alliances not just for operational advantage but to maintain relevance and project authority. Meetings with influential figures, correspondence with former allies, and careful public positioning reinforced the idea that he remained a man whose judgment and leadership mattered. He had learned that perception is often as powerful as reality, and in exile, he managed both with precision. The endgame of Luciano's life in exile was shaped by a combination of pragmatism and legacy building. He understood that he would not return to the streets of New York in the same capacity, but he could influence the next generation, shape policy within organized networks, and ensure that his vision endured. He sought to stabilize the structures he had created, cement alliances, and maintain oversight of operations without needing to engage directly. His exile became an exercise in long-distance strategy, a testament to the scalability of his genius. Luciano's final years were marked by a balance between reflection and active engagement. He navigated political pressures, managed complex relationships, and monitored operations across continents. Though physically removed from the epicenter of his empire, he continued to exert authority, demonstrating that true power is adaptable, strategic, and resilient. Exile transformed him from a street-level tactician into a global strategist, capable of orchestrating influence without immediate proximity. Ultimately, the exile years revealed the full scope of Luciano's genius. He had survived the brutality of the Castellammarese War, orchestrated an empire from the shadows, navigated imprisonment, and now exercised influence from afar. While the streets of New York were no longer under his constant gaze, the systems he had built ensured continuity, loyalty, and profitability. Exile was not defeat, it was a test of adaptability, intellect, and foresight, all qualities Luciano had mastered. By the time of his death in 1962, Lucky Luciano had transformed from a street-smart hustler into a legend of global crime, an architect whose influence transcended geography, politics, and time. Exile had allowed him to demonstrate that power is not merely about presence or intimidation, it is about networks, strategy, and the ability to shape outcomes invisibly. In this way, his final years became a culmination of a life defined by vision, calculation, and the unyielding pursuit of control, a testament to a man whose enemies never saw him coming and whose legacy would endure long after he was gone. Lucky Luciano's legacy is one of paradox and power, a story where brilliance and ruthlessness coexist in a delicate balance that reshaped the criminal underworld forever. Unlike mobsters who relied solely on brute force or intimidation, Luciano was a strategist, a visionary who understood that true control depended on structure, psychology, and long-term planning. He transformed the mafia from a chaotic, feudal collection of gangs into a modern, organized enterprise with systems capable of surviving his physical absence. This transformation did not merely consolidate his personal power, it fundamentally altered the rules of organized crime in America, creating a model that endures in some form to this day. His most enduring contribution was the creation of the Commission, a governing body designed to prevent internecine warfare and regulate disputes among families. By introducing a system of checks and balances, Luciano institutionalized negotiation over bullets, diplomacy over retaliation, and profit over pride. The Commission became both a stabilizing force and a mechanism of centralized control, ensuring that the chaos that had characterized the mafia before the Castellammarese War would not repeat. Through this innovation, Luciano demonstrated that intelligence and organization could achieve what raw violence never could: enduring influence and systemic resilience. Beyond structure, Luciano revolutionized the psychological and cultural dimensions of crime. He understood that fear alone was a brittle tool, loyalty had to be cultivated through opportunity, reward, and respect. Ambition needed direction, and human behavior had to be anticipated, guided, and sometimes manipulated. In doing so, he professionalized crime, creating an ecosystem in which men operated not out of blind obedience, but with calculated alignment to a larger vision. This subtle mastery over the minds of others became as important to his empire as control over money, territory, and illicit enterprises. Luciano's influence extended far beyond New York. By fostering transnational networks, leveraging ethnic diversity, and engaging in strategic partnerships, he created a criminal model that could operate across cities, states, and eventually continents. The efficiency, discipline, and adaptability of these networks made it difficult for law enforcement to dismantle them completely, ensuring that his methods, if not always his direct command, persisted long after his exile. In effect, Luciano transformed crime into a scalable enterprise, demonstrating foresight that transcended borders and generations. The duality of Luciano's legacy is also striking. To the public, he was both a villain and a genius, a man whose charm and intellect made him fascinating even as his brutality inspired fear. To historians and law enforcement, he became a case study in strategic leadership, organizational design, and criminal psychology. He proved that empires can be built as much in the mind as on the streets, and that influence, perception, and foresight often outweigh muscle, intimidation, or force. This intellectual dimension is a key reason why his story continues to captivate audiences decades later. Luciano also reshaped the economics of organized crime. By turning gambling, prostitution, labor racketeering, and bootlegging into profitable, systematized enterprises, he demonstrated that criminal activity could be managed like legitimate business. Standardized procedures, delegated authority, and accountability mechanisms allowed his operations to thrive while minimizing exposure to law enforcement. Profit became the central currency of loyalty, replacing the archaic systems of hierarchy, ethnic exclusivity, and arbitrary violence that had defined the mafia before him. This economic rationalization ensured both efficiency and longevity. Equally important was Luciano's ability to adapt. From the streets of New York to the prison cell, and finally into exile in Italy, he demonstrated resilience and strategic flexibility. He learned to navigate changing political, social, and legal landscapes without losing control over his networks. He understood that survival required anticipation of threats, management of human behavior, and the ability to project authority without relying solely on personal presence. Luciano's adaptability ensured that even in moments of apparent weakness, his influence persisted, a testament to the durability of the systems he built. Luciano's legacy also carries a cultural imprint. He became the archetype of the modern gangster in American imagination, a blend of intellect, ruthlessness, charm, and strategic genius. Movies, literature, and documentaries have repeatedly revisited his life, not merely to sensationalize his crimes, but to examine the psychology, ambition, and vision that set him apart. In many ways, he became the blueprint for understanding organized crime as both a social phenomenon and a complex, adaptive system. Yet, Luciano's story is also a cautionary tale. The very brilliance that allowed him to rise to unprecedented power could not shield him from law, exile, or mortality. Even the most sophisticated empire is vulnerable to external forces, and the intersection of human ambition, law enforcement, and circumstance eventually tests every ruler. His legacy is therefore dual. It is one of mastery, innovation, and enduring influence, but also a reminder of the limits of control, the inevitability of consequence, and the ever-present risks inherent in a life built on manipulation, crime, and ambition. Ultimately, Lucky Luciano's impact on organized crime is immeasurable. He left behind a model, a structure, and a methodology that continues to inform both criminal networks and scholarly study. He redefined the mafia, created systems of power that outlasted him, and proved that influence, foresight, and intelligence are more potent than brute force. His enemies never saw him coming because he was always several steps ahead, and his legacy endures because he transformed an inherently chaotic world into a predictable, manageable, and remarkably resilient empire. In reflecting on his life, one sees more than just the story of a gangster. One sees the story of a man who understood human nature, systems, and strategy at a level few have matched. His empire was not merely built on fear or violence, but on insight, calculation, and the ability to navigate both the seen and unseen forces that govern human ambition. Lucky Luciano's legacy is a testament to vision, a vision that reshaped organized crime, influenced generations, and ensured that his methods, if not always his name, would endure indefinitely. In his final years in Italy, Lucky Luciano lived as an exile, removed from the streets that had once defined his empire, yet still deeply involved in guiding it from afar. He relied on trusted intermediaries to maintain influence over operations in the United States, ensuring that his vision and authority endured despite the physical distance. Exile allowed him a period of reflection, where he could consider the human cost, moral complexity, and long-term implications of the empire he had built. Even away from New York, his reputation commanded respect and fear, reinforcing that true power lies not in presence alone but in foresight, networks, and the subtle management of loyalty and perception. This period underscored Luciano's adaptability and strategic genius, proving that even in exile, he remained a central force shaping the world of organized crime.